let's get to the reason we're all here tonight. Tony Unwick. I've known Tony for a long time. I think we first met in person at that product camp at Yahoo years ago. You were speaking at that product camp at Yahoo, and you were kind of one of my heroes because I had read your book and I loved it. So that was cool. And then, as I said, this is his third time speaking here. It's always a very popular topic. Everybody loves hearing what he has to say. He's a founder and CEO of Strategyn, which is a company that applies the concepts and helps companies, have more successful products. Before that, he worked at IBM. I know he worked on the PC Junior as part of his origin story. It's very cool. It's like a Marvel superhero. He's basically one of the pioneers of jobs to be done. There are a lot of people these days that like claim to have been involved or whatever. He's like the OG jobs to be done person, which is why it's always great to hear his thoughts on it. And he's the author of What Customers Want and his newest book, Jobs to Be Done. His Twitter handle is @Ulwick. So be sure to tweet if there's something you enjoy. Tony, thanks so much for a great talk. Now we're going to transition to our fireside chat. Cool. Well, you mentioned that for a given job, there are often over 100 needs, right? So to me, it sounds, and I remember reading in What Customers Want, you advocating this. I'm like, wow, it sounds like you're getting very detailed in how you're defining needs. And I'm just curious if you find it's common that teams get that detailed when they're defining the problems or needs.
Traditionally, they don't, right? And this is part of the problem. They'll say, companies, we talk to our customers, they want to get the job done if they're even in job space, that's more conveniently, faster, more reliably, more safely, at a level of granularity that's useless, quite honestly. And what we're trying to do is to understand the job at a very granular level. And that's why we do it this way, right? We want to know how they measure success at each step. What are they thinking? What are they trying to achieve, right? Because you could say, get the job done faster. Where, right? Along what dimension? At what part of the job?
Right.
Or easy to use is another great one, right? It's got to be easier to use. When we first experimented that with Motorola back in the 90s, there were 30 different outcomes that described what easy to use meant. And when we quantified it, 3 of them were underserved. That's it. But boy, satisfying those 3 unmet needs really made a big difference. So you got to satisfy them at a very granular and define them at a very granular level. That's what it takes to win.
Yeah, and what do you, in your experience, why do you think the reason is most teams or many teams don't get that far into the details?
I don't think they're trying to prove that their concepts address unmet needs. They don't agree. They don't agree on what a need is, right? It's there's no. It's fun having ideas, right? It's easy to have ideas too, right? Everyone can have ideas. Everyone can be passionate about their ideas, and that's great. Not everyone can go through a process and define markets in this way and define needs that way and quantify them. It just takes a lot of work, right, in order to de-risk the innovation process to that degree. And a lot of people don't have the tolerance or patience for that. So following the needs first approach is okay.
Yeah, makes sense. It kind of like brings up some kind of rigor versus time trade-off. Like, how much time do you want to spend on this, versus how rigorous do you want to get in it?
Yeah, show progress with the product as opposed to go, show progress with the research, right?
Yeah, cool. The next thing is, I know in other talks, you've been focused on needs so much that I think you've seen patterns or you've identified different categories of needs, right? So could you just briefly talk about the categories of needs that you've come up with?
Are you referring to emotional job statements and things like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I debated whether to include this in the presentation, but I think it's important. So there's 3 types of customers that we talk about, in the market ecosystem. So when people talk about their customers, they have the job executor. This is the person who uses the product to get a job done. So that's the person I talked about through the whole presentation. But you have other customers, right? You have the product lifecycle support team. Those are people who help support the product throughout its life cycle. So people that have to install the product and set it up, maintain it, upgrade it, dispose of it, right? Now, of course, people aren't buying products so they can set them up and install them. They're buying it to get a core job done. But if these jobs are not well satisfied, then the product could fail as well. And then you have the purchase decision maker who's got often a financial job that they're trying to get done. They're trying to reduce time to market. They're trying to reduce product costs. There's some high level statement that they would describe. So those are three types of customers, and they have different jobs, right? And I think this answers your question. So we have the job executor who's getting the core job done. Again, this is the job around which the market's defined, as we talked about before. Then we have what we call related jobs. You could think of these as adjacent markets, right? They're other jobs that people are trying to get done while they're trying to get the core job done, right? And these become nice opportunities for extensions on your product. Then there's emotional jobs. So people often want to be perceived a certain way as a result of using a product, and they want to feel a certain way as a result of using a product and getting a job done. So knowing what those emotional jobs are great, and we often use those to help position the product through a emotional lens as well as a functional lens. So very effective. Then we have these consumption chain jobs, right? As we mentioned, people have to install a product, set it up, learn how to use it, interface with it, maintain it, upgrade it, repair it, right? And then you have the job of the purchase decision maker. Right, so those are the different types of jobs, but this wheel goes a little bit further, right? We can look at the steps in the job, and that's where we get our job map. And then we have the outcomes associated with the with each of the constituents as well. So I like looking at this. I use this tool to help frame and scope out projects, for example. And I think I have this set up here too. Let's say I'm a manufacturer of drug infusion pumps. All right, well, what would I want to study? All right, so I want to know the core job of the user of the drug infusion pump, which would be the caregiver or the patient. And I want to know all the steps, and I want to know all the outcomes associated with getting that core job done. All right. And I also, since I make drug infusion pumps, I also have to study this consumption chain job where it's the pharmacist who has to set this up for me, right? So they have to put the drug in the drug infusion pump and do that effectively. And then I also have a biomed that has to clean this out at the end to help me get it ready for the next iteration, right? So these would be my key customers and concerns and to focus on in order to help people get the job done better. So this may be what I study, right? This is how I would go to my qualitative research. I'd go to caregivers and patients to understand this job. I'd go to the pharmacist to understand the setup routine. I go to the biomeds to understand this. And maybe I want to go to the purchase decision maker too to see, what financial job are they trying to get done. So I like using the wheel, and I think this helps to conceptualize how to frame out a project and who you may want to talk to.
Yeah. No, it seems like it's cool because you've done this so much. So you've categorized the different people, the roles, and you've categorized the steps or the categories. So it's great.
Yeah. It's fun.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for sharing those exercises. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Cool. And then in your talk, I love the Steve Jobs and Henry Ford quotes. One thing you mentioned was incremental innovation. And oftentimes in the product world, we talk about incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation. So I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on how you think about the difference between those two, and if we need to operate differently based on which one we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone really wants to just pursue incremental innovations, right? Now, the way I define disruptive innovations is the way Clay Christensen defined disruptive innovations, right? That is, it's a solution that initially gets the job done worse, that you're charging less for, but over time you get the job done better. And eventually you're getting the job done better and cheaper than the competing solutions. At first, you're only getting the job done cheaper. So it appeals to non-consumers and overserved people. But eventually, if you can get the job done better and better, then it appeals to underserved people as well. So that's a great way to win with a disruptive approach to innovation. But going back to your question on incremental improvement, unless you know all the customer's needs and all of the unmet needs, chances are you're going to be heading down this incremental improvement path, right? And I mentioned it earlier, what are the chances that you're going to address the top 10 unmet needs for product if you don't know the top 10 unmet needs? It's not going to happen, right? If you add 10 features, maybe 2 of them address the top 10 unmet needs, and maybe the rest just are copying competitors, right? And just adding costs and really adding no function, right? So that's why I think it's really important to lay out the whole model, so you understand what all the needs are and all the needs that are unmet, and the different segments that have different unmet needs. Because let's go back to that most efficient path to growth concept, right? Ideally, all of you want to work on the fewest number of things that will have the greatest positive impact on the largest customer population, right? Would we agree with that? So if that's what we're trying to do, we're trying to find unmet needs that are highly unmet across the biggest population, right? Now, the only way we're going to do that is to lay out the model like I described here, do it at a granular level, quantify it, segment around it, so you can figure out, well, what is that most efficient path to growth? It's worth doing because no one else, your competitors aren't doing it, right? They're guessing. And this is why I love the Kroll on-track example. It took competitors 15 years to catch them because they were always on the most efficient path to growth. Nobody could get ahead of them because they had to catch up and then do the next thing, and they just could never do it. And that in and of itself is a competitive advantage. So, hopefully that answers that question, Dan.
Yeah, no, and I think you bring up an interesting point, which was, hey, it comes to prioritization. If you want to do a good job prioritizing the biggest opportunities, you need all the needs. If you have an incomplete set of needs, it's almost like you're doing a local maxima. You're identifying the biggest opportunity within the subset versus the global biggest opportunity, right?
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah, you don't know you don't know what all the opportunities are. And it's not like you can manufacture an opportunity, right?
Right.
So either a need is unmet or it's not. So what that means to me is you really want to cast the widest net possible.
Exactly.
Don't miss anything, right? Go wide, go bigger. I'd rather do a survey with 150 needs than with 75 because it was faster and cheaper, right? The rationale is cast a wide net. Don't let any opportunity escape, right? And that's why going granular, going deep the way we do and the way we prescribe is really effective.
Yeah. No, and I call that exploring the problem space. And so it's even in the qual that you're doing when you're first figuring stuff out, you want to just like cast as wide a net possible, like try to discover as many different needs that you could address, even if they seem silly or irrelevant, right? Just to get that more comprehensive list.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's often the case too, where our clients will look at our list of 100 and say, hey, you forgot a couple. And we say, well, okay, well, add them. Let's get them in there and let's test them to see if they are unmet needs. I mean, there's little harm in adding. I mean, if they're not unmet needs, they're not going to be prioritized highly. So
sure. Yeah. Well, it's always funny because you got the breadth, and then what you bring up then is you need breadth and granularity. You don't want to miss an area of needs. And within an area, if you're not granular enough, you could miss some opportunity, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You want to look at each area and figure out how people measure success when getting the job done. What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to avoid? Right? What are their concerns with getting the job done quickly, predictably, and with a great result? Again, that's why I love the framework. It keeps things simple, because if you think of a job as a process, you can only improve a process along 3 dimensions: speed, predictability, and throughput and output. That's it. So the outcome-driven innovation process is designed to capture needs that relate to those three things as defined by the customer.
Right. That sounds good. And that's actually a great segue to the next topic I want to bring up, which was, in my mind, jobs to be done helps you focus on customer value and what is it really going to take to deliver more customer value. And when I think about the consumer, like part of what the value equation for them is, what's the price? And I know we haven't talked about pricing at all, but I'm just wondering, how should people think about pricing their product when it comes to jobs to be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. In our surveys, we often ask willingness to pay questions, but they're not traditional willingness to pay questions because we don't have a product yet, right? So what we want to know is, how much do you pay today to get the job done? And how much would you be willing to pay to get it done perfectly? Right. So you can think about that like getting a haircut, for example. What do you pay to get your haircut? And what would you pay if you could get it done perfectly? Those might be two different numbers, right? And the first number describes the size of the market as you define it through a product lens. The second number defines the size of the market as you define it through a problem lens, all right? And they could be different. But in many instances, we find that people are not willing to pay more to get the job done better. So I'll go back to the Kroll on-track example with electronic evidence discovery. They were paying so much already to get that job done. It was being done by hand. It was very manual and time intensive. They're like, I want a solution that gets the job done better and cheaper, right? And they let us know that. So in that realm, you realize that there is no price elasticity, right? We were working with a maker of off-road vehicles, and we found a segment of people that had about 15 unmet needs, and they were not willing to pay more to get the job done better. And as it turned out, they just wanted basically more power to help traverse difficult terrain, but they didn't want all the other bells and whistles that were adding cost to the vehicle, because they use this vehicle as a workhorse. It wasn't like something that needed to be accessorized. So they wanted more of something at a lower price point, which is, in the good, better, best pricing mindset, you'd never find that segment of people, because if you're going to add power to, you're going to add features, right? You're
charge
just
more. Yeah.
So that was an interesting one as well. So I think by just asking those simple questions, you can see if there is price elasticity, and it will help you decide what kind of strategy to focus on. If people are underserved and willing to pay more, then we follow the differentiated strategy. Get the job done better, charge more. If people are underserved but they won't pay more, then we have to follow what we call the dominant strategy. Get the job done better and cheaper. And the beauty of that, of course, is that appeals to everybody. Overserved people, underserved people, every segment of the market wants that product. Right.
All right. Nice. Well, that ties back to something you mentioned briefly, or you mentioned Clay Christensen's work about disruptive innovation. And I assume it's like innovator's dilemma kind of content and S-curves and things like that, where you actually think about the price versus the performance, right?
Yeah.
Got it. And so maybe even if you could, for people that might not be familiar with that, can you tell people a little bit more about, you mentioned briefly about, hey, initially the disruption comes from below and things like that, but just what kind of the high level takeaways were from that?
Yeah. Geez, I wish I had my slides for this setup for me, but what I like picturing is I have my little matrix where it says, get the job done better and more cheaply. Is it getting done better? Am I getting it done cheaper? And you can picture the lower right quadrant where you're getting the job done worse, but cheaper, right? And that's where your initial product goes. But once you've established a foothold in that market, some technologies are disruptive technologies in the sense that you can keep adding features to that technology to get the job done better and better. And then it makes its way up into the upper right quadrant where you get the job done better and cheaper. So technically, the way I describe that is you executed a disruptive strategy. In other words, you created a product that got the job done cheaper and worse, but that doesn't mean you have a disruptive technology. right? That's different. Like a disruptive technologies like a digital camera, right? The original digital cameras, you could argue, got the job done worse, but they held the potential to get the job done significantly better, making that a disruptive technology. I would argue like Uber, for example, they have their carpooling offering, which is a disruptive offering. It gets the job done worse and cheaper, right? So it follows that disruptive strategy, but carpooling isn't a platform level solution or a disruptive technology that could then be built upon to get the job done better over time, right? So even though they're following a disruptive strategy, it's not a disruptive technology, and therefore this disruptive innovation, this movement along this path over time doesn't occur, right? So I think those are some of the nuances associated with understanding that. And the same thing's true coming from the other angle, right? Like originally you could get the job done a lot better and charge more, and then just start dropping your price over time, right? So eventually you're getting the job done better and cheaper, right? Which is a great strategy as well. And Apple followed that to some degree with their iPhones, right? That once with their used products, you could just get cheaper and cheaper products that got the job done better.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Got it. No, that's great to hear that way of thinking about it, and that you can have, like, just because you're able to offer cheaper product doesn't mean it's truly a disruptive technology, basically.
That's right.
Yeah. Got it. And the true disruptive ones are the ones that are then able to do it better and cheaper.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Awesome. Great. Awesome, Tony. Well, great to chat with you about those items. We have a lot of questions, and let me pull that up and we'll get to those. And let's go to the Q&A. So the first person is Mark Lauder. Go ahead, Mark. Thanks for asking a question.
Great, thanks. Hey, Tony, longtime listener, first-time caller. The question is about, you mentioned asking folks how much more they would pay or how much less they would expect to pay. I found that getting real answers about money from people is difficult when they're not actually parting with money. Yep. Have you used techniques or have some recommendations on how to increase the quality of that feedback?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We've worked on this for years. We're not much farther along than we were 5 years ago. We have the same trouble. See, what we've learned is that when the job executor is also the buyer, you have a better chance of getting good information. So we find that in B2C applications, right? So like if you're a toothbrush manufacturer, you go talk to people who buy toothbrushes or use toothbrushes, chances are they buy them as well. So they can give you better insight into what they'd be willing to pay because they're the actual buyers. But in a lot of B2B situations, the buyers, not the job executor, they're two different people. So the job executor may say, yeah, I'd love to pay more to get the job done better. But the buyer says, no, we're not, we can't do that. So we end up separating these questions out. Like we'll do the project first with the job executor to come up with the right product concept. And then later on, we can go to the purchase decision maker and ask them if they're willing to pay more to get the job done better if the solution does all these things, right? And we've tried to get numbers like 1% better, 5% more. The only way I look at it is if they can just tell us they're willing to pay more as opposed to not willing to pay more, that affects the strategy. Because when it comes to ideation, then you can go into like the Bosch team and say, hey, you got to come up with a solution that gets the job done better at the same price point. Or you can come up with a solution that gets the job done better and maybe at a 10% price premium. Like if you can just give them some direction so they can innovate with or without that price constraint, that's helpful. But we always encourage our teams to get the job done better and cheaper, and then you can decide later if you want to charge more or not. And of course, that drives more profitability.
Yeah, helpful. Thanks for the answer.
Sure. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, great. Thanks. And then let's see. Next up, we have Leslie. There we go. Welcome, Leslie. Go for it.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Tony. Thanks, Dan. I was curious if you had any user interview tips on how to get at the heart of what a user is trying to accomplish, what sort of job they're trying to accomplish. I struggle with this when trying to help them, articulate outside of the application. They're so focused on clicking here and what your application does. It's hard to get them to imagine, what exactly they're trying to accomplish without the application in front of them. So just curious if you had any tips.
Sure. So, it is a challenging process, but what we generally do, we go into what we call immersion sessions. This is my favorite technique. We did one today in the cryptocurrency market, which was super fun. But the general idea is to find a subject matter expert that's a job executor, and spend 2 to 3 hours with them, maybe longer. We've spent as many as 6 hours continuous with people like this, and go through the entire exercise. What we generally start with is some initial ideas of what we think the job might be, just to get the conversation started. And we might put up 4 or 5 options, and then we say, okay, here's the product, right? And you use it in conjunction with these other products. We know that. Given that, how would you describe the job you're trying to get done, right? And so they look through our list. They may come up with another one, like they had last week. We did that, and someone said number 4. The number 4 option, that looks really good. It doesn't always work like that. They could say none of them look good, right? Here's what we're trying to do, and start explaining it to us. But that gets the conversation started. It may take an hour or more just to define what the job statement is and gain agreement. Sometimes we do this with 2 or 3 subject matter experts at a time, never more than that. But we're trying to reach consensus on what they think the job is. All right, so once we're done with that, then we create the job map, right? So it's nice and slow, right? The way I describe this to folks is you're taking them on a slow motion journey of what you're thinking about when you're getting the job done. So a lot of people love talking, they love talking fast. I like slowing this down to a snail's pace, where we're just step by step laying out, what are you trying to achieve? And so the questioning is, I try to keep extremely simple as well. Whether you're at the job level, the job step level, or the outcome level, the questioning is, so what are you trying to achieve? Right? At the job step, so what are you trying to achieve next? After you've done this, then what are you trying to achieve? And then what? And then when you go to the outcome level, so what's the first thing you're trying to achieve in this job step? And then what? And is there anything you're trying to avoid? Right? And basically that's the questioning. If you move away from that questioning, you risk getting into solution space. And that's when you start talking about the clicks here and there and the interface, right? And that's what you're trying to avoid. So we work very hard to set up the interview and prepare people to talk in problem space. And we never talk about solutions through the whole interview, because as soon as you do, they're going to jump back into solution space, and there goes your conversation, right? Now, if someone were to say, I like this product better than that one, you can say, well, what feature do you like about that product? They could tell you the feature, and you can say, well, what outcome does that help you achieve, in essence, right? What does it help you get done? You're trying to do something. How does it help you, do that? And maybe you could extract it back from solution space into problem space. But try to keep the questioning very narrow, because the goal here is to come up with that list of 100 plus statements, right? It isn't to find out about what solutions they're using and all the other things that could be brought up in a qualitative interview. It's very purposeful, right? So we got to keep in mind what we're trying to achieve. The other thing I'd like to say about the interviewing process is that we're setting up both parties for success. What I mean by that is, in a traditional interviewing process, the interviewer and the interviewee neither know what a need is, right? So neither party knows what information they're looking for, right? And our approach, we know that we're looking for an outcome statement. We know how it's going to be formatted. We know it's going to be in a job step. And when we're doing this with the participants, we're doing it on a screen, like a Zoom call like this, and we're showing them what we're typing. So they follow along everything that we're doing. So they're learning what we think is important. And so we're typing, minimize the time it takes to X, or minimize the likelihood of this bad thing happening. They catch on. And after about 30 minutes or so, they start talking to us in outcome language, because now they know that that's a good input and they're trying to be helpful, right? Versus nobody knows what input you're looking for, so no one knows when you have a good input, right? So it really works very effectively once both parties know what the goal is. And that's probably the biggest hint I could give you in terms of being more efficient and effective at the interview process.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thanks. That's a cool technique. I haven't seen that happen where you're showing your notes as you do it. That kind of helps build shared understanding. That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So next up we have Carrie.
Hi, Tony. I went through your training about 1.5 years ago. It was transformative. So thank you for that.
Good to hear.
And I want to do a hat tip to Mark to bring into healthcare space. I'm actually in the process of some debate with some marketing or traditional folk who want to use personas for what's personalized medicine.
Yeah.
And personalized medicine, as you can imagine, that's a space. I know you do a lot of work in the healthcare sector. Personalized medicine usually is referring to genetics, but can also be, in my opinion, on the psychology side, the uniqueness about an individual that makes them different from another person with otherwise the same characteristics.
Yeah.
So in the jobs to be done lens, how and when do you bring in personalization characteristics versus those broader buckets that you were talking about when you segment and cluster?
Yeah, we don't try to create a persona until after we segment and cluster, right? So what you try to do, like you try to define the market very broadly up front and include everybody, all, like in the Bosch example, it's roofers, it's framers, it's electricians, it's it's everyone, right? And you could argue those are personas, right? So you definitely don't want to use those personas up front, right? Just like you don't in healthcare space. You want to include, you don't want to use any personas. That's why you want to define a market as a group of people getting a job done, right? And you want to define it as broadly as possible. And only later, after you've defined the segments that have groups of people with different unmet needs, do you want to apply a persona. But then it's a needs-based persona, right? It truly is a group of people with different unmet needs, right? It's not a persona just for the sake of they have different demographics or other characteristics. Like, I guess you could argue it depends why you're trying to create a persona, but in my experience, most people are doing it because they're trying to create a segment of the population that is tangible, that they can focus on, right? That you can attach something to, something that makes them very different. Okay.
So let's assume, and in this case, the nature of the discussion I'm having with these folks has been arguing your same point, which is personas. If you need personas, they come from the evidence, not a priori, right?
Yeah.
So then once you've identified your segments and you've maybe got a convenient handle that you name each of these segments, when then do you bring in, how do you mix this segment type analysis along with then the customized tweaks that are used for sort of fit and finish when it comes to a product?
I think if I understand it correctly, so you have the outcome-based segments, let's call them that, but you have to tie from a marketing standpoint, they want to know, well, how do I find these people, right? Is that it? Where they're saying,
actually, I wonder if Dan, if you can help me on this one. In this case, I'm thinking about healthcare, but if we want to broaden the conversation to product in general, there's personalization, which is then you start to get, how do you tailor something for this particular individual who's going to be different from other people in that segment? That's where I'm asking is, does this question come up when you're helping customers and they want to know when to get really granular about individuals because they've gotten as fine-grained as you want to about segments?
Got it. Okay, that's really good. Okay, so we like when you have that questionnaire of the 100+ outcome statements. We put that out to 1,000 people, whatever, and you find segments of people. But this doesn't mean you can't customize an offering for everybody. So let's say you wanted to customize something for an individual. You could give them the survey to figure out what's important and not satisfied to them, right? And customize the solution to address their unmet needs. I actually have a mass customization patent on this that I had filed and got approved back 20 years ago. I think it's expired by now, but that was the general idea, is to say, if we know all the outcomes people are trying to achieve, just have the individual tell us what's important and satisfied to them, and then configure the solution to address their version of the unmet needs.
Okay, so sort of like a post-segment analysis. Okay.
Well, it's like you're just customizing it to see what that individual finds important and unsatisfied, right? So it throws away your whole original customer segmentation analysis. It says, forget about segmentation. Let's just customize the offering for this individual.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, part of the product offering is to get them to tell you what's important and unsatisfied with all the outcomes, and then you can have different versions of your solution depending on what they think is unmet.
Well, I think about the segmentation as like that should inform that at the feature level, but then that customization should be how somebody can fine tune it as sort of a preference level for how they interact.
I see. Okay, yeah, sure. So you could have your broad level of products at the segmentation level and then fine tune it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
thank you.
You have that tool, that questionnaire. It's a very useful tool to apply at the individual level.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thanks for your question, Carrie. Okay, next up we have Ritesh.
Hey, Tony. Questions. How many interviews do you suggest doing, right, for the job executor? And then follow up, right? In B2B scenario, I think you mentioned there's hundreds of people you survey or even more, right?
Yeah.
So in B2B scenarios, right, where you don't have access to maybe 100 of job executor, right? How many customers would you say that is the bare minimum to do the survey for?
Sure. So on the qualitative side, we generally don't talk to more than 10 people. And it's because we do these immersion interviews. So we may have 2 immersion interviews that last 3-4 hours, and we can capture 80-90% of the outcomes in that set of interviews. And then we might do 3 or 4 more interviews, and just to validate everything we have. So we take the complete list that we've created, show it to the next person, have them go through it, validate it, add to it, take that list, go to the next person. So we keep building it, and everyone sees everything that's already created. So we're just gaining consensus on this set of need statements. If you have a global audience, take that last set of needs and see if they're valid in Germany or Brazil or wherever, right? And just validate them across geography as well. On the quantitative side, we've had situations where we were working with jet fighter pilots, for example. I mean, you're not going to get 1,000 of them to fill out a survey, right? But we were lucky enough to get 12. And that is a bare minimum. I mean, you really want to get 30 statistically as it's described, but it's not always possible. I've worked with clients that had, we did a workshop with them, for example, and we captured a set of needs from 6 people sitting in the room. There were external customers, but they came in for the event. And after we collected the set of needs, we asked them to prioritize those. And they were happy with that. I'm saying, that's not what we're recommending here. You should really take this out to a wider group of people and make sure you got statistically valid data. But they said, this is 10 times better than what we normally do. So we're okay. Don't worry about us. Now, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying these are the things that happen. The rule of thumb we like using is, if you're not going to segment a market, bare minimum 30. If you're going to segment, if you're going to run the segmentation analysis, bare minimum 90. But comfort level is, you want 270 or greater is where we start feeling more comfortable with the data cuts.
And do you include, emotional jobs also in these interviews and surveys, or those handled somewhat differently?
No, they're included in there as well. Just like that on the wheel that I was showing you, the graphics and how we laid them out. So if you're focused on the job executor, you can add, you have outcomes on the core job, you can have related jobs and emotional jobs. So you can, all those are attached to the job executor.
Thanks.
Sure.
Great, thanks, Ritesh. Next up, we have Richard.
Thanks for the great talk. I think my question I RTFM'd and I had my answer.
It was how to calculate the opportunity score. If you want to just give a quick answer, Tony, that'd be cool.
Oh, how to calculate it? Oh, yes. So
yeah,
the opportunity score is the algorithm is importance plus the importance minus the satisfaction. And I thought I had the slide in the deck too, but it didn't pop up, so I might have had it hidden. But we asked people to tell us how important the outcome is. We put it on a legend where we have not important at all, somewhat important, important, very important, extremely important. We do the same thing for satisfaction. And what we're trying to figure out is which needs are very or extremely important, but not very or extremely satisfied. Right. So what we're saying basically is if an outcome is very important across the population and not very satisfied, then it's an opportunity for value creation. So we ask people to fill out the survey, and then we look at the percent of people that rate it a 4 or 5. Right. So it's the percent of the population that rates it a 4 or 5 for importance, the percent of the population that rates it a 4 or 5 for satisfaction. So these are dimensionless quantities that you can then apply and put it in the formula to say what percent of the population says this is really important versus, important and unsatisfied, and out pops your answer. So you plug in that percentage importance. Let's say 95% said it was important and only 20% said it's satisfied. It would be 9.5 plus the 9.5 minus the 2, and I can't do the math in my head, but that would be your answer. Too old for that.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it. All right. Next up, we have Craig Peters.
Yeah, Tony, I think you answered my question actually just a couple of questions ago, or part of the answer. I was wondering if you've ever had a situation where you're really not able to do the survey part about how important and how well the need is met. But then you mentioned the example of having 6 folks and your client was saying, hey, it's way better than we used to have. Perhaps that was the answer. Something's better than nothing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the attitude of many. I think that's right. The statisticians would say that's horrible advice, and that's why I caution to say that. But something is better than nothing. And if those customers are like your top customers, in this case they were, it's like, yeah, let's listen to our top customers. They're telling us what we want, what they want. Let's listen to them. So, but quite honestly, it's not that hard to get even a small number of like 30. There are many, it's so much easier now than it was 30 years ago. There's all these panel houses, people have opted into filling out surveys, and almost everything's run through a panel house now. Even physicians are recruited through panel houses, which helps as well. So I would go down that path or follow that route and try to find a panel house that has access to a sample and use them. Chances are, like 90% of the time, you'll find something.
Great talk. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Craig, for your question. Next up, we have Girish.
Hey, Tony. Love your talk and this topic, which I've been on it from, I think, a couple of years now. My question is, like, how do you marry this process of, jobs to be done with innovation diffusion curve? And many times that's also touted as one of the great way to, start the new product. So we can shed more highlight, where it intersects with your process.
And you're calling it innovation diffusion?
It's like Jeffrey Moore's crossing the chasm model with segmentation of early adopters versus late adopters.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So I always found that interesting, the early adopter concept. What we often find is that there's almost always a segment of people that are highly underserved, and they're the early adopters, but they're not early adopters because they love technology or they're gadget geeks or this or that. They're generally underserved because they're struggling to get the job done, right? And this is often the best way to make inroads into a market. If I could show you different segmentation schemes, like you may find a market where there's only, like in that Bosch example, you saw that example, right? Yeah. All the other segments are overserved, but there was one segment that was underserved, all right? That means if you're going to get into that market, the only path to success is going after that underserved set of people. They will be your adopters, right? But we see that in even markets that are not well or not very mature, right? There might be some people that are underserved, some that are overserved, some in the middle. There might be two different underserved segments. You know, to win, you try to find the most efficient path to growth, right? It's still the same equation. What's the fewest number of outcomes I can go target to have the biggest impact on the largest customer population, right? That's your early adoption. And just keep following that path, right? You do them first, you do the next most underserved segment next, you do the least underserved segment last, right? And that's how it works. And you may never capture 100% of the market, but you're entering it in the most efficient manner.
Makes sense. That helps.
Sure.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for your question. Yeah, and I think we've had Jeffrey Moore on 3 times as well. He's a fan, and one way that he might answer, the way I would combine these things in my mind would be that the early adopters, they have exactly what you said. They have it's most underserved for them. But then as you cross the chasm, what happens is there are additional needs that become important to those other segments, like things like, like more scalability or things. There are other things, reliability or more social proof. There may be emotional jobs like, hey, how many other people have used this? Like, it's like the whole nobody got fired for IBM. So I think that's the way Jeffrey would talk about it, saying, hey, the early adopters are so focused on that smaller set of core needs and they really need that performance boost. And so they're willing to do it. But then when you try to take that same thing that only addresses a subset of needs that are required for the broader market. So the idea would be some of the needs, there are additional needs that the broader market cares about more that weren't as important to the early market. That might be a possible explanation. I don't know.
Yeah, Dan, I like that. I think the way I might say that is that, the initial segment that you go after has a certain set of needs that the next segment doesn't have, right? So
exactly.
That's why there's another segment. There's another group of people with a different set of unmet needs. In order to go there and be successful, you have to address their unmet needs as well.
Yeah, cool. Great. Okay, next up we have Matt B.
I was just curious if the odds ever worked out where you realized that there were 2 competing companies using jobs to be done against one another.
I do know that about 35 of the top 40 medical device companies use ODI. So I don't know if they know that, but I guess they do now.
There you go. That's a cool question. Yeah. And then the question is just, you had said, do they just cancel each other out? I guess it comes down to how well they're executing. There could be differences, even though they're both doing ODI, for jobs to be done, there could be different in quality of execution, right?
Yeah. Well, as I've always said that, everything else being the same, it still comes down to creativity. Like if everyone knew the top 10 unmet needs, the ones that come up with the best solutions are going to win, right? So it still comes down to that in the end.
Very good. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Right, cool question, talk. Matt. Appreciate it. Thanks, man. Okay, and then our last question is Melanie B.
Hi. So I think you answered a lot of it because I was really curious about your interviewing process. I've read your books and it's not covered too much in there, but the last part that I was wondering about was that bit about sharing the outcomes list. And at what point do you start doing that? And how does that piece of it work?
Yeah, we start right from the beginning. So in the first interview, like I said, like today with the crypto one, that was fun. We spent 2.5 hours today. We ended up with the job statement and the job steps. We never got to outcomes. So it took 2.5 hours just to clarify the job statement, the job steps. Now, what we'll do in the next interview is we'll start with the same statement and job steps, and we'll show that to the next person and explain to them how we just spent hours talking to this other person, and here's what they thought. Can you verify, or should we debate what these items are? And so we'll go through that list and build consensus with yet another person, and then maybe get into some outcomes. And then the third person will see the same thing all over again. We show them the whole list. So it's like we're building a puzzle as a team, right? And the goal is to gain consensus interview after interview. You may find in the third interview that the job statement is not perfectly stated. You may find in the fifth interview that there's a couple of job steps that are out of sync or missing, right? And so you just keep working with different experts to get it right, right? And that's the way we view the process. We're trying to put together this puzzle. We want to go at it in a very slow, methodical way. Like I said, it's like picture yourself in slow motion. Think of a surgeon, like, for example, giving us these outcomes on removing an anatomical structure. I mean, when they're in the mode, they're thinking so fast, they're talking fast, you can't possibly capture what they're doing or what their needs are, right? So you got to slow them way down. So step by step, the first thing you do is what, right? And then you write down the statement, put it right in front of them, right? And they see, yeah, that's the thing we're doing. They can either validate it or help you improve it, and so on. Next statement. And then eventually they get to pace too. Like, we're trying to capture one outcome every 2 or 3 minutes.
Right. Yeah. So sort of really excavating it. It sounds like it's a great approach. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not rushing through anything. And by not rushing, you can end up with a set of need statements after, 6 to 9 hours of interviews with the right people.
Sounds very efficient in the end. Thanks.
That's the goal. Yep. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks for your question, Melanie. Appreciate it. And that was the last question. So Tony, thank you so much for spending time with us to share your talk with the Fireside Chat and answering all the audience questions. Really appreciate it.
Dan, it's always a pleasure. It's good fun. Thanks for arranging, setting up, and being a good host.